Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
China releases a new national human rights action plan. The world's nuclear weapon spending surges to a record high, and the world's experienced its second hottest May on record. Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our first story. China has released the National Human Rights Action Plan and the opening ceremony of a forum on global human rights governance in Beijing. The action plan covers a 5-year period until 2030 and aims to make sure that the people's principal position is respected, their fundamental interests safeguarded, social fairness and justice promoted, and the fruits of modernization benefit all people more fairly and extensively. It also stresses accelerating modernization in agriculture and rural areas and improving the education, social security, and healthcare systems. For more about China's National Human Rights Action Plan, we're joined by Professor Qu Qian with the Belt and Road Research Center at Mizzou University of China. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. What do you see as the most significant priorities and new features of this plan compared with previous documents regarding China's human rights?
I think people-centric and people's welfare target is always Chinese government's top priority. So I think the most outstanding feature of these times planning is it planned for the next 5 years. And also, I think it emphasized the high quality development, which embedded or included in all the human rights, endeavors inside of it. For example, high quality is a very important keyword in here. And also, how can we have this high quality, treatment for everybody, no matter where you are, in a village or in a city or in a suburb, in the East or in the West? So everybody will have the equal treatment. I think this is a very important signal. Well, China used to be with rather weak resources. So sometimes we can only guarantee that everybody will have the basic treatment. And now, ever since China has already been lifted up in the economic development, so I think more of the resources will be headed towards, the higher quality of the living standard. So that's the reason why it comes to the second concept, which is coordinated and systematic. Because this whole plan actually covered about the economy, society, culture, and politics and environment, and etc. So which means it's not just about the basic rights. It means the comprehensive development that we'll have in here. And also, as I mentioned, so people-centric is really, really important because it means, and we've emphasized that the development result of the modernization should benefit everybody. So this is going to be the key. And also, besides this kind of the general treatment towards everybody, and I think we will still have some preference, but this kind of preference means vulnerable people, vulnerable group, like the women, children, elderly, physically challenged groups, and all these people actually will have more of the preference and special treatment. For example, we're going to build more of the friendly equipment, infrastructures, and the digitalization, equipment for them. And meanwhile, we're going to have the international reach. So, which means we're going to take a very important reference of the international standards so that we can, recalibrate our effort towards the best practices globally.
And the action plan also places a strong emphasis on economic, social, and cultural rights, including employment, healthcare, and education. So why are these areas considered fundamental to China's human rights agenda?
Well, it's not just some, very high-end concept, but we have to understand that in China, what we value the most and what we prioritize, we're not America, we're not Singapore. So we still are a very large developing nation with a huge population, 1.4 billion in population. So what is the top human rights for everybody? If you do some interview, on the street, you will find out people are still, paying most of the attention to their rights of the development, their rights and entitlement for the better living standard. So up until that, and we will, upgrade our human resources and the human rights effort to some other stage. But currently, let them have a decent life. Let them don't need to worry about the schooling, don't need to worry about their health care and a pension, even though in America people are still paying attention to that. But in China, we try our best to guarantee that at least everybody will have some bottom line guarantees in their basic living rights and the development rights. So I think this is the most urgent expectation for people. That's the reason why President Xi Jinping emphasized the high living standards and people's expectation towards that is our important priority for our effort. So that's the reason why when we're doing this, we mean jobs, we mean better health care, we mean easy access to the school, very, very low at cost of the school and the healthcare. In China, we wouldn't have our children to be burdened by very expensive student loan. We wouldn't trap our working class with unpaid healthcare bills. I think that is what democracy means in a socialism country, because democracy means not just a vote. It means that everybody will be entitled to have their fair share in all the social results that have been produced all nationwide. So I think that is very, very different concept. So if you come to China, you will have very different understanding about all this. Well, if your children can go to the school, the best schools, with only 1,000 US dollar per year, when you can have all kinds of the treatment in the hospital with more than just 100 US dollar to take care of your usual conditions, and that is something you feel that you are taken care of, right? So that's what we mean about inclusiveness and the comprehensiveness of the human rights.
And China also highlights emerging fields of human rights. So, as technologies such as artificial intelligence, big data, and digital platforms become more widespread, what new human rights issues are likely to emerge?
Well, I'm glad you asked about that. Yes, what you mentioned is really new. It's not only a challenge for China. I mean, when we're talking to our friends and other scholars in America, in Europe, or in ASEAN nations, they all feel that. For example, we have very large population base, 1.4 billion. I think the same problem has been shared with Pakistan, India, Indonesia. And also they want to have this wide reaching and fundamental guaranteeing kind of the human rights system. Especially, how can we incline towards the vulnerabilities like the seniors, the children, the physically challenged? So this is a problem. And secondly, how can we bridge the gap between those different regions like the East and the West? So that is when we have to introducing in AI and digitalization. Well, it really helped us to improve the efficiencies and empower us with many, many tools. But when it comes with the yang, there always comes with the yin. So the abuse of the people's personal information. So the discrimination happened with the algorithm. For example, if you are slow physically, for example, if you are physically challenged, so you cannot drive a cab, or your delivery speed is slower. So sometimes ordinary algorithm will say this is probably a lower quality or lower standard, staff. So they wouldn't give you more of the order or give you more of the bonus. So that is going to be a problem we need to deal with and to deal with it smart and properly. And we're going to look into the digital spelling, which is being enlarging the gaps between ordinary people and with the people with the conditions, right? And also the moralities, and ethical standard for the AI will also be dealt with. So, well, this is really something new. So we're still trying to come up with a solution and thorough plan. But I think we're already on the way. For example, in China, we have already established WADA, the WDO, the World Data Organization, to deal with all the challenges together with all of our friends and partners, all over the world. So I think in this next 5 years, this kind of challenge will be properly tackled.
Now, China's Human Rights Action Plan has a very wide range of goals across economic, social, political, and environmental rights. But what is needed to ensure the plan is effectively implemented, and how to make sure that the action plan will turn into real actions and tangible outcomes?
You see, we have a very different understanding about human rights. Actually, human rights actually come from us and later to be copycatted by the West, right? Before the Soviet Union, before socialism countries appeared in this world, the human laborers are being abused. The child labor has been working in the factory for more than 14 hours a day. And we're talking about the black slaves. And we're talking about, the banana publics in the Caribbean countries. They wouldn't need to, even think about that until the socialism forces has been appeared in the whole world. And we upholded the banner of democracy together with human rights. But in here, human rights and democracy, as we mentioned, means everybody will have a fair share in national assets, which means you will be taken care of with the basic social convention with agreement. If you work hard, you don't need to worry about your house. The country will take care of it for you. If you work hard, and your children will go to school for free. And if you work hard, you will have the 8-hour working system and you're going to get pension. And that's the reason why when the West has been seeing this and we're seeing all the mess happening in the Second World War, they decided to change and follow suit. So that is the difference about our ideologies, But later, democracy, when it goes to the West, it can morph into some other form. For example, well, I wouldn't guarantee you have that. Well, Mrs. Satchel says, well, you have to work hard, earn every penny you need, and nobody's going to cover your button, right? So, but I give you a vote. So if you're not happy, you can just shout and curse, and you can do nothing else about it. So you see, this is a very, very serious situation. So on one hand, you can criticize, but on the other hand, you have to pay the student loan, the mortgages up until the last moment of your life. You will get broke and you're going to face the killing lines and nobody's going to save you. So the social convention is dying. And that is the reason why many Nordic countries and West European countries stand out and say, this is wrong. We need to learn from those socialism, creed, and we're going to have socialism countries. So this is a very different concept. So in the future, what China can do to foster this trend already been happening. So I think number one, for a developing nation like China, what we can do is poverty alleviation. We still need to lift, lots of the people out of the poverty, even though we have already won the campaign by the year of 2020 to eradicate the absolute poverty in China. So in China, nobody needs to live under the standard of $2 per day right after that day. But still, we have relative poverty still exists. So which means the poorest people still have a very, very large space and a potential to uplift the living standard. But in China, we believe in teaching people how to fish. It's more important than just to give them the fish. So this is our idea, and we're going to extend those ideas to other countries. And also in the Global South nation, we have been initiating the campaign, help them to build their own capacity, to nurture their own future engineers and talents, and also give them the capacities to have, the future, like the AI, open source, to give them the solar panels, and also to teach them how to do the modernized agriculture to feed themselves. And all of these actually will happen on the base of the rule of law and on multilateralism. So I think that this is what we can do about the global human rights issues. Instead of just a talk and give you an empty promise, we give you things, capacities, and a promise the future.
Thank you very much. That was Professor Chu Qiang with the Belt and Road Research Center at Minzu University of China. Coming up, a conversation about the right to development as the 2026 Forum on Global Human Rights Governance kicks off in Beijing. This is World Today. Stay tuned. Now we continue to follow what's going on at the Forum on Global Human Rights Governance in Beijing. The event marks the 40th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Right to Development. My colleague Gao Yingshi, who's covering the forum, had a chance to sit down with Hossein Askari, Vice President of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden.
So, in today's global human rights system, which core values of the right to development most need to be strengthened? Is our understanding of development itself changing?
Yes, we have, in terms of international discussion about the human rights, we have to distinguish between things which are, we can call universal, and things which are certain rights that are contingent on any society's cultural, social, historical development. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all on all aspects. There are certain fundamental universal rights, which I argue the right to development, or in China, we call it the right to subsistence, is a universal because we have to preserve the dignity of humans by providing them with this basic necessities like food, clothing, housing, but also healthcare, education. These things are flexible. They can develop and the list can become longer. But these are the basics. Why? Because of our human nature, not only that we need to be dignified, but by providing these things, we can practice our creative powers, which distinguish us as humans everywhere in the world from other species. We use our creativity to discover new universal principles in science, technology, and even culture to improve our productivity, improve our living standard for everyone on the planet, not only for our society. But if we don't have these basics, we will not be able to achieve this higher level of creativity, of cultural, scientific, and technological development. So this is why the right to development should be a universal and fundamental right.
The Belt and Road Initiative has built ports, railway, and power plants across developing worlds. And how have these projects advanced people's right to develop?
Yeah, the general misunderstanding about the Belt and Road and also the ancient Silk Road is that this is about trade, exchanging goods from one point to the other, which is not true. The most important thing which happens here is the development of the local communities along the road. You say in China, to get rich, you should build the road first. And then part of it's not only the physical railways and highways and water canals and power plants, which improve the living standard of the people, but the exchange of ideas about science, technology, and culture are very, very crucial because you raise the skills of the local population and their productivity alongside the physical hard infrastructure. So this is very, very important. And we see things happening in many countries, for example, in Africa, that along these railways, like we have in Ethiopia, we have the railways being built, the hydropower plants being built, and so on. But along these are popping up industrial parks, universities that support these industrial parks to increase the productivity and utilize these infrastructure projects for increasing the living standard and the productivity of the population through modernization and industrialization, exactly as we saw happening in China in the past 4 decades. So this is a combination of many aspects of the infrastructure, science, technology, know-how, skills, all developing together. So this is what is unique about the Belt and Road Initiative.
So beyond the hardware, lasting development means helping nations innovate for themselves. So how does the Belt and Road Initiative's approach to technology transfer differ from the old Western aid model?
Yeah, the aid model, which is a failed model, is actually to cover up for extractive policies subjecting African nations to, because the West, Europe mostly, later the United States, what they do is they extract the raw materials from these regions and give very little back in terms of economic development. And this is what nations are now protesting against, and they want a change. What China is doing is, which is different, like in the old colonial system, you have railway from a mine to the closest port to extract and take away goods from Africa. The Chinese Belt and Road is integrating the regions of Africa and the nations of Africa together to make them one major productive economic unit. And this is what is interesting here, is that instead of so-called aid, which is just a cover-up for looting those countries, you provide real tools for these nations to become productive themselves. Like you say, give a man a fish one day and he will eat fish only one day. Teach a man how to fish and he will eat fish every day. And I think this is the Chinese policy and philosophy, which is increasing the skills and the ability of those nations to generate and regenerate wealth by using their natural resources, their human resources for their own development. This is beneficial for China too. This is what the Western model doesn't understand. This idea of win-win is beneficial for everyone, because the wealthier the African nations and Asian nations become, the better economic partners China will have. Will have better, wealthier, and healthier markets for Chinese goods and for Chinese exchanges and technology. So China is transferring technology to empower those nations rather than helping those nations. So China is changing the aid program from helping to empowering, which means that those nations will stand on their own feet to become prosperous.
In the AI age, what's the biggest threat to the right to development? As rich economies dominate computing power and data, could a tech gap locked in inequality and block people's right to develop?
Certainly a major impediment for development is inequality, what we call technological apartheid, segregation. I mean, in Africa, people don't have even access to internet. Almost half of the population don't have access to sustained internet connection. Half of the population don't even have access to electricity, sustained electricity. But with the AI age and now things going into very, very rapid development, many nations will be left behind because many of the new production systems, economic systems, industrial systems depend on the integration of AI, information technology into the industrial processes and even in agriculture. So many nations risk being completely left behind in this process. And therefore, these nations, I know some nations a little bit more advanced in the developing sector, they are trying to achieve what they call digital sovereignty, where they have access to not only the highest technological processes, but be able to domesticate this technology and integrate it into their own social and economic systems. So this is a very, very big challenge for many nations who risk being completely isolated and left behind in this progress.
What impact do China's global governance initiatives have on human rights and development, and how do they differ from traditional Western view?
Well, I think what the Chinese governance initiative helps is, first of all, to stabilize global security situation, because things are getting out of control. International law does not apply anymore to some major powers like the United States, Israel. They take their own interests as the law, not international law, not humanitarian law. So they completely sidestepped all international law, and this created an enormous erosion of the role of the United Nations, international law, the United Nations Charter. China wants to amend that difference. Now, what this does to human rights is it removes this double standard and hypocrisy we have in the West, where human rights in the West means completely different things than the rights of other people. For example, the rights of the Iranian people, the Lebanese people, the Palestinian people are completely ignored in the West because they are being subject to genocide, mass murder by Western powers or Western-backed powers like Israel. And China is trying to amend this situation by saying, look, you cannot have two different standards for things. And the human rights should be part of this governance system. And we cannot have this hypocritical system where human rights are used as a weapon selectively when it fits the interest of these big powers, as they did in Libya, Syria. They say, well, we have to protect the rights of the Libyan people, Syrian people against their government. And then they invade these countries or foment civil wars, which ends killing hundreds of thousands of people, but ends up with militias and terrorist groups taking over the country. And we see this all over the Sahel in Africa. So this is what the Chinese role here is like, we have to go back to the UN Charter. Nations are independent and sovereign, and there should be no interference in their internal affairs, but we can get agreement on how we define human rights and where the role of cooperation and dialogue and diplomacy comes into this picture. But without respect for the UN Charter, without respect for international law and diplomacy, nothing can be achieved in this sense.
That was Hossein Askari, Vice President of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, speaking with my colleague Gao Yingshi. More to come. Nuclear weapons spending in the world surges to a record high. The world experienced its second hottest May on record. And the World Conference of Classics explores ancient wisdom for modern challenges. You're listening to World Today. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. We'll be back after a short break.
name is Alessandro Golombiewski Teixeira. I'm a professor of public policy and management at Tsinghua University in Beijing. I am a great listener of The World Today. In my opinion, The World Today is one of the best China radio programs. In The World Today, we can get the best news and analysis in what is happening now in the world. So please come to join us.
You're listening to World Today with me, Do Hongyu, in Beijing. Global spending on nuclear weapons has hit a record high, with the United States outspending all other countries combined. According to a report by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, spending on nuclear arsenals rose nearly 20% last year to almost $120 billion. The United States remained the largest spender, allocating just under $70 billion, or nearly 60% of the global total. The organization says the figures highlight a sharp increase in military spending amid escalating geopolitical tensions and renewed competition among major powers. For more, Shi Yawen spoke with Dr. Yuan Yue, assistant professor at the Institute of International Relations, China Foreign Affairs University.
Dr. Yuan, the U.S. not only spent the most on nuclear weapons, accounting for nearly 60% of the global total, but also recorded the largest since last year at 22%. So why does the U.S. continue to devote such enormous resources to its nuclear arsenal while calling on other countries to pursue nuclear disarmament?
Well, from my perspective, I feel like this question should be understood in a broader context of Washington's pursuit of strategic advantage. So, that recent years, the United States has modernized its nuclear triad while developing missile defenses, space capabilities, cyber, AI-enabled systems, and global perception strike capabilities. So, I feel like the United States right now is seeking to build an integrated strategic architecture covering detection, striking, interception, etc. So if we look at it from a strategic perspective, the United States has recently emphasized the so-called damage limitation capabilities. That is meant to reduce an adversary's retaliatory potential while it has its own survivability and defense capability. So first, for example, the recent discourse like Golden Dawn can also reflect their intention to integrate the nuclear forces, its missile defenses, its space-based interceptors, etc. But the challenge is that the strategic stability really depends on all sides maintaining credible second strike capabilities. So if there's one country like simultaneously strengthen its nuclear strike capabilities, its missile defense, space-based sensing, etc., the others will naturally worry about the strategic balance. That is why, China has always consistently maintained that countries possessing the large nuclear arsenals bear special and primary responsibilities to make substantive reductions and to create conditions for multilateral nuclear disarmament.
Well, reports suggest the U.S. is actively discussing the possibility of expanding its nuclear weapons hosting arrangement to additional NATO countries like nations like Poland, expressing interest in participating. If that happens, could such moves further lower the threshold for nuclear confrontation and increase the risk of miscalculation?
Yeah, as that risk is very real. We know U.S. nuclear deployment in Europe are themselves a legacy of the Cold War. If those arrangements are expanded and more countries are brought into this nuclear sharing mechanisms, definitely regional tensions and strategic mistrust will inevitably increase, because the forward deployment will shorten the warning times to compress crisis decision-making and also draw participating states to more deeply into nuclear competition dynamics. Also, nuclear sharing arrangement will place pressure on the international non-proliferation regime and blur the distinction between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. So indeed, that is very dangerous.
Well, at the time when the major U.S.-Russia arms control agreement expired and no replacement in sight, how serious is the breakdown of the global nuclear arms control system?
I think this problem is extremely serious and actually goes far beyond the decline of traditional arms control treaties. It's a question not only about the erosion of the old mechanisms, but also the inability to establish effective new ones. We know, like today's, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty still remains the core global pillar, but itself has under increasing pressure. For example, this year, the 2026 NPT review process did not produce any substantive consensus. Meanwhile, like arms control in space, in AI, in cyber, in hypersonic, etc., all lacking binding rules. That really makes sense become worse and worse. Also, like emerging nuclear cooperation arrangements such as AUKUS, and together with the possibility that more small and medium-sized states may move closer to the nuclear threshold, will also challenging the integrity and authority of the NPT regime.
We have noticed that the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute warns that nuclear weapons are being placed on higher levels of operational readiness, while advances in artificial intelligence are increasing the risk of miscalculation. So against that backdrop, are we witnessing the most dangerous period for global nuclear security since the Cold War? And what can be done to reduce the risk of miscalculation?
It is fair to say that we are facing one of the most dangerous periods for nuclear security since the end of the Cold War. The weakening of arms control mechanisms, accelerating nuclear modernization, and AI, they are overlapping with each other. So as you mentioned, AI deserves particular attention because it has a dual impact on strategic stability. So first of all, AI can improve verification, like imagery analysis and risk warning capabilities. But meanwhile, AI can also introduce black box decision making, false warning, cyber vulnerability, etc. So if AI is deeply integrated into nuclear warning, command and control systems, or missile defense systems, the danger of miscalculation could increase significantly. So that is why, like, China has recognized this challenge at an early stage. Like we submitted this position paper on regulating military application of AI to the United Nations in an early stage. It is to say, like, major powers really need to strengthen their cooperation and establish mechanisms for evaluation, transparency, and accountability in military application of AI to ensure, like, nuclear weapon states can, to ensure that nuclear decisions remain under effective and responsible human control at all times.
And lastly, Dr. Yuan, with no new treaties on the horizon, what innovative approaches could be pursued to rebuild trust and verification mechanisms among nuclear-armed states? Could multilateral frameworks or new treaties realistically emerge in the next decade?
This is a very tricky question, actually. So right now we know, like, many of those old treaties has already outdated. Those legally binding treaties cannot be signed further. That's the reason, like, it's very important to seek, like, multilateral mechanisms and to develop those modern and new forms that really requires, like, different countries to increase their understandings with each other, to have more and more dialogue, to minimize mistrust between each other and miscalculation.
That was Dr. Yuan Yue, Assistant Professor at the Institute of International Relations, China Foreign Affairs University. Coming up, the world experienced its second hottest May on record. This is World Today. We'll be back.
Hello, I'm Yin Liang, Kramer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University. In a rapidly changing world, staying informed has never been more important. World Today delivers sharp analysis, global perspectives, and the stories behind the headlines. It is your trusted source to understand what's shaping our world. World Today, bringing the world closer.
Welcome back. The European Union's climate monitor says the world experienced its second hottest May on record. The Copernicus Climate Change Service says the global average surface air temperature last month was over 15.8 degrees Celsius, second only to May 2024, and over 1.4 degrees Celsius above estimated pre-industrial levels. An early and intense heat wave hit Western Europe in the second half of May, with France, Britain, Ireland, Spain, and Portugal recording unusually high temperatures. Feels like temperatures reached 35 to 40 degrees Celsius in some areas. The average sea surface temperature was also the second highest on record, behind May 2024. For more, we're joined by Dr. George Zygopoulos, Director of EU-China Programs and Senior Research Fellow at the European Institute of Nice. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Zygopoulos.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, several countries, including France, Britain, Ireland, and Portugal, broke temperature records in May. So how unusual is it to see such widespread extreme weathers across Western Europe at this time of year?
I would say that unfortunately this is the new normalcy in several European countries. So heat waves are part of everyday living conditions, especially in the summer period, but also before the summer period, highlighting the impact of climate change and outlining how difficult it is for ordinary citizens to live under these extreme temperatures. So to sum up, it is a new situation in Europe, which is becoming the typical normalcy that European citizens need to live with.
Mm-hmm. Now, Western Europe and Southern Asia both experienced an unusually early heat wave this year. Why are high temperatures coming earlier in the season this year?
I would say that the impact of climate change has been diagnosed for years, so we cannot necessarily identify the reasons for this year only. We can place the phenomenon into the general debate about climate change and the impact of climate change, because 2 years ago, for example, in Europe, as you correctly mentioned before, heat waves had also been witnessed. So it is quite difficult to say why this year the heat waves broke out earlier than expected, I would say, but it is quite rational to suggest that more collaboration is required in order to deal with the climate change phenomenon and its impact on different citizens of the world, especially citizens who are not able to deal with high temperatures due to economic calamity.
Now, the global average temperature in May was more than 1.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. How close are we to the 1.5 degree threshold highlighted in the Paris Agreement, and why does the threshold matter?
Well, the threshold matters to start with because it is a legally binding commitment made by states in 2015 and entered into force 1 year later in 2016 in order to deal with climate change, in order to limit the impact of industrial activity as far as consequences for high temperatures are concerned. It is not very easy to measure up to what extent the world will be able to meet the objectives, because the United States in particular is a country which, according to the president who is in power, decides whether to abide or not by the commitments of the Paris Climate Accord. Right now, for instance, the United States under President Trump has decided to withdraw, as it had done also in the first administration of President Trump. But most of the countries are on a good way, if I could say, in order to meet the objectives which are necessary to guarantee prosperity and fair living conditions for ordinary citizens.
The average sea surface temperature in May was also the second highest on record. What factors are driving the warming of the oceans?
Well, again, this is linked to climate change and the El Niño phenomenon, I would say, which is pushing winds toward a direction which is increasing temperatures. The problem is serious, especially in the tropical Pacific, and we expect the high temperatures to rise very soon. Again, this is certainly connected to the problem of climate change and what countries need to do as far as international collaboration is concerned in order to protect the oceans and in order as much as possible to keep the temperature of oceans quite low.
Building on that, how are rising sea temperatures affecting the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events around the world?
I would say that from the moment that oceans store energy, in the years of climate change, the role of sea and oceans is crucial. It is certainly positive that under the UN umbrella, a treaty about the high seas was ratified at the beginning of the year, which can increase international hope in the international community that countries can work together in order to protect maritime biodiversity and the protection of the oceans in general. As you suggested, there is a linkage between high temperature and the role of the oceans. So without international cooperation, it is impossible to deal with the problem, which is already very serious and dangerous.
Now, as extreme weathers like heat domes and rainstorm become more frequent and intense, what impacts does it have for economies, food security, and our daily life?
Well, I would start with daily life, and especially for citizens who are not able to pay for air conditioning, for example. In days of extreme heat wave, conditions are extremely difficult, especially for old people or for families with small children. And then as far as food security and energy security, obviously climate change is closely linked to the determination of governments to deal with these challenges. Energy poverty is an important problem, which is certainly accelerating the problem, especially in the global south. And that's why international cooperation is required, because without international cooperation, not only countries of the global south, but also in the global north will be unable to deal with the existing problem, which is deteriorating despite the commitments made during the Paris Climate Accord.
And finally, what measures should be taken by the governments to better protect public health and infrastructure from the climate challenges?
Well, countries themselves have set up national plans in order to deal with climate change, obviously in line with the Paris Climate Accord. But the problem that we are currently witnessing at the international level is that the discussion about climate change has become very politicized. In my opinion, climate change is a problem which is a transnational one. As I said before, it cannot be tackled without international cooperation. But from the moment politicization tends to dominate the discussion, we cannot be extremely optimistic about future targets. I remain hopeful that the seriousness of the problem will lead governments to work together, irrespective of other problems or irrespective of disagreements. And I mentioned before the example of the UN Treaty on the high seas, which is an indication that there is some hope for international cooperation under the UN umbrella.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Dr. George Tsougoupoulos, Director of EU-China Programs and Senior Research Fellow at the European Institute of Nice. Coming up, the World Conference of Classics explores ancient wisdom for modern challenges. This is World Today. Stay tuned. Academics and officials from around the world are calling for the application of classical wisdom to address today's global challenges amid growing geopolitical tensions and rapid technological change. More than 200 participants from over 20 countries adopted an initiative at the Second World Conference of Classics in Athens, Greece. Evangelos Ipsos has more about the conference.
Beneath the neoclassical columns of the Academy of Athens, more than 200 academics, officials, and cultural figures from over 20 countries are attending the two-day gathering, jointly organized by Greek and Chinese institutions. Under the theme Dialogue Between Ancient and Modern, the conference is examining education, social responsibility, peace, and technological change. Speakers also highlighted the growing cooperation between Greece and China in research, culture, and classical studies.
Through modern interpretations of humanity's ancient classics, we can awaken classical wisdom and guide the ship of human civilization as it cuts through the waves, advancing steadily toward a distant future.
Standing here at the Academy of Athens, the central question is not what ancient civilizations left behind, but whether their ideas can still guide our societies facing artificial intelligence, geopolitical confrontation, and social change. Artificial intelligence emerged as one of the opening ceremony's strongest themes, with speakers warning that technological progress must remain anchored in human values.
In the face of artificial intelligence, what should concern us most is whether our humanistic traditions can be preserved. We must not allow technology to become a runaway horse, racing uncontrollably toward the abyss.
The message from Athens: classical wisdom may not provide ready-made answers, but it can still help humanity ask the right questions.
That was Evangelos Ipsos reporting. For more, my colleague Liu Xin spoke with Professor Zhang Yongle from Peking University. Let's take a listen.
First of all, let's help them understand exactly what we're talking about when we're saying the classics here, and why are we talking about this at this moment?
There are a narrow definition of classics and a broad definition of classics. I think the first words, a conference of classics, actually adopt a wider definition of classics. So here, classics are pretty much defined as a foundational text, idea, institutions, and those values that came together with the world's major civilizations were first taking shape. So they are the bedrock of each civilization. And they raise the big basic question that we all share as humans. And they set a super high bar. They're always open to new interpretations. So first of all, they have a very shaping effect. And the second is that they are always succeeded and reinterpreted all the time. So I think, they are very important today when we begin to think about, how the human being, how the different civilizations can coexist and co-prosper. So a deep understanding of the tradition of the classics for each civilization is very important.
Why is China in particular placing so much emphasis on classical studies? And when China means classical studies, what exactly does it refer to?
Today, I think China is promoting classical studies. There are different reasons. First, we are realizing more and more that our path to modernization is distinctively Chinese, and a lot of Western theorists just cannot fully explain it. To understand ourselves, we need to grasp the classical foundation underneath China's modern development. And second, a lot of modern problems need the wisdom from classical sources to solve. So as long as China gets more and more developed, a lot of modern problems appears. Then we have the urgent need to go back to the classical wisdoms. And the third, as China pushes forward with building a community with a shared future for mankind, we have to dig deep into the classical heritage of all civilizations if we want to find ways for everyone to coexist and flourish.
Yeah,
These
Professor
are
Zhang,
reasons for us to...
Yeah, you mentioned something really interesting. For instance, the distinct cultural characteristics of Chinese civilization, which may not be shared by other countries. Can you give an example, for instance, and how can we help the world understand that something that's by and large Chinese?
Okay, for example, in China, we have a civilization which starts in very early period of time and keeps very continuous and never break. And it is also a very large-scale civilization with very large territory and a very large population. And so compared to many other different civilizations, which are divided into different states, coexist and conflict with each other, China for 1,000 years, we enjoyed such a big scale civilization. And this pretty much shaped our understanding of, politics, society, and individual life. So today, when Chinese think about, our own way of modernization, then we always think about, there must be a kind of like, a very strong central government. And China also, for example, we have a very strong notion of secularism. In China, our local religion is not as powerful as in many other civilizations. I think all these are very important features of the Chinese civilization.
For a lot of people, this may sound very fetched, either talking about faraway lands or people or works or talk about ancient words. Why are we looking into classics for clues to solving today's problem? Can we really find clues?
Well, I think as the society becomes more and more industrialized, actually we need more ancient wisdom because we have encountered a lot of problems. For example, the division of labor. In today's world, the division of labor has become more advanced. But then, this will cut off. This will cut your knowledge, the picture of knowledge into pieces. So everyone is capable of one profession, but without knowing the knowledge of others. And this will bring a challenge to your own development of your personality. So then classics will tell us that you always look at how to develop personality fully, comprehensive. And also, for example, now we have the challenge of technologies like AI. AI is shaping our society dramatically. So how could we manage development of AI? Then we have to go back to the wisdom of classics to see whether those arts has an ethical purpose, and to always use this ethical target to manage those technology. And also in terms of question like peace and war and political order, I think there's always the concern about whether this material expansion, those expansion of glory, those honor, those discussion of all these things can truly lead to the human happiness. So I think the classical wisdom always asks, what is the real purpose of human life? Whether this kind of today's militarism, those discussions about the political civilization, those kinds of really can bring us happiness. I think all these are classics, what classic can bring to us.
Can you share a tip as to one piece of advice, one piece of work you can quote, you can think of at this moment that will help people answer these questions?
For example, as you know, the China's sage Lao Tzu has a saying, 道法自然, 道法自然, which the Dao, the great way, actually follows the nature. So actually, this is really kind of discussion about, teaching about the relationship between our arts and the moral purpose of the words. And also, the Chinese sages always talk about, all under heaven, 天下, 天下为公, the whole under heaven are for the public. And these are very important teaching about how to avoid war and how to bring the solidarity of human being.
Well, these are very big topics and we have very limited time. So very actionable tips. If someone is interested in start re-engaging with classics, both in Chinese or in other languages, where should they start and what they should not do?
I think our experience of studying Chinese classics is actually we start from poetry. So the ancient Chinese, the Shi Jing, when we are very small children, so actually we starting with the poetry, we learn what is beautiful, and then from what is beautiful, and then we begin to think about what is right, what is just, and then we will reading other Confucian classics.
What should they not do?
Well, what they should not do is that, simply in today's world, because you have the AI, then you ask the AI what kind of ideas are in these texts, then AI simply give you a very simple answer. Those answers tend to be very conservative, tend to be very simple.
That was Zhang Yongle, Associate Professor of Law at Peking University. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Do Hongyu in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.